In week 8, the assignment where we were watching the video on the Mohawk people, I think one of the things that really stood out to me initially, one of the things that one of the tribe's members stated was that the women came to the front, and she was explaining that they felt like it was their responsibility to be in the front. And I think the way that she worded it was to protect our land, to protect our mother. And that really stood out to me because it really demonstrated the view of the land as their mother, and how intimate and important that relationship was to the Mohawk people. And I think that was the piece that the government, the Canadian government, was missing, right? They were just turning it into a golf course, their land into a golf course. Not to mention the history of what had happened to that land and the relationship that the Mohawk people have had with the land, and how that has been systematically taken away from them by the government, and whoever the government is, right? Whether it was the French, the English, the Canadian government itself. It seemed like kind of the Mohawk people and their land, which is their mother, was on the losing end of this conflict every time. The mayor said in this particular instance, said that they were something along the lines of they didn't feel it was right that, this is the Canadian mayor of that town saying, they didn't feel it was right that they had to negotiate for 75% of our land. And I think it's interesting that he thought of the land as their land when really it's the Mohawk people land, and it had been for thousands and thousands of years. Additionally, it showed the different understanding of land, whereas the Mohawk people felt the land was their relative, was their mother, and that intimate relationship that people have with their mothers. The mayor thought of the land as our land, like something to possess and be owned, whereas the Mohawk people saw the land as something to protect, and something that was like an intimate part of their family and a relation, and something to really kind of coexist with versus ownership. I think another thing was, this is kind of just an aside, but that they were talking about how the SWAT team had no spirit, and then that comparing that to like the trees and the bushes that they felt had spirit, that they were also trying to protect in that area. So just kind of an interesting dichotomy there between the SWAT teams that were brought in, that were like robots, I think is what they call them, and with no spirit, versus the trees and the bushes and the land itself, which was full of spirit, which is what they were trying to protect. So I thought that was kind of an interesting relationship there as well, that it wasn't the humans and the conflict that the native Mohawk people saw as like kindred spirits or kindred relationships with. It was the land and the things on the land. And actually that's when originally the shooting took place. They said is when the military or armed forces crossed over the bushes and like I think trampled the bushes, is when that erupted into like a violent matter, right? Yeah, so I think that's kind of the main thing. The other thing is that I feel like the Mohawk people had, they knew what they were fighting for. They were fighting for these relationships, whereas the government was just fighting for ownership of something. So just kind of like when you're trying to protect something that's your relationship or that's like a part of you, just a different feeling and like emotion that's in it when you're just like fighting for ownership of something. So just I think that kind of, you could see that playing out in that role, in that dynamic as well. And then the last thing that I thought was interesting is that they talked about, they were talking about the constitutional, and actually all the governments that had failed the Mohawk people, and how like systematically that happened again and again. But then the Mohawk people said that they were true to their constitution, which was established by the Creator. And I just thought that was an interesting point of view, in that they believe and understand their relationship to be, or their constitution to be created by their creator, whereas the other constitutions by the other people were done by humans. Sorry, that's my kids in the background. And then the last thing is that the Mohawk people itself, they were describing their role in the First Nations tribe, like Confederacy. I think it's Confederacy. Anyway, and their role was to be like that first line, that protective line for when different peoples came across. Like they would go through the Mohawk people first. They were kind of like the sentinels, like the people who stood guard over the rest of the tribes. And I think that's interesting that this is still the role that they were playing in this conflict that we saw. They were still standing up and being that front line, that people of warriors who were like protecting their way of life and their tribal constitution, really. So you can see how that play out, and I think it's really interesting in that the way that it wasn't just their people but their land too that was what they were protecting and fighting for. Thank you.